Baruch Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Menachos Daf Hey, Menachos 5. We're going to get started. Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach. On the top of Hamid Aleph, the first line which says Mesave. The Gemara is raising a refutation of a teaching of Rav. Rav has taught that our Mishnah said that all the Menachos that you brought, Shalol you did an action there with the wrong intent. So the mincha is valid, meaning you could still eat the shirayim and bring up the komets, but you have not fulfilled your obligation, with the exception of the mincha of the sinner and the mincha of the kenos. That's the mincha of the sota woman. Rav added to that the idea of the mincha of the omer, the barley offering, which is brought on the second day of Pesach. That there he says it's also disqualified, and the reason is because it's coming to be mati or something. It's coming to allow something, and since that's not allowed, therefore it's the thing is coming to be mati or is not allowed. The eating of the new grain, therefore it's also disqualified. In addition to that, Rav says also this is true by the asham of the nazir and the asham of the mitzvah. Since they're matirim, then if they're done with the wrong intent, it's also disqualified. The Gemara challenges Rav from the Brisa, Meisvei asham mitzvah shenishchat. If we have an asham of a mitzora, the one who has tzaras, and he's asham was slaughtered shalol ishmo, osho nitamidamo agave bahonos, or the blood was not placed on the bahonos, the right thumb, the right ear, the right big toe. It's valid, even though it was done with the wrong intent. Could we go upon the altar and you bring the nesachim for it, the libations. Vitzarach asham acher lachshiro, and you'll need another asham to allow him to re-enter into the society. So we see now, like Rav, that the asham mitzvah is going to be kosher if it was brought shalol lishma, but you cannot fulfill your obligation. This is now what Rav says. Rav says it's not even able to be offered; it's totally disqualified. So tiyuvta de Rav, there's a refutation of Rav. So now we've seen Rav's principle that the mincha of the omer that was brought with the wrong intent is disqualified. We now have the position of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says mincha omer shekam shalol lishma keshera. Unlike Rav says it's psula, but Rav says it's kshera, it's kosher, but shira einecholin ad shetavi minchas omer acheres v'tatirena. But you can't eat from it because it's from the new grain. You need a minchas omer to allow you to eat from it. So you can't eat from this grain because you have to wait until the replacement omer is brought. And then once the replacement omer is brought, then you could eat from this barley of the first minchas omer. The Gemara says, wait 1 second. How could you bring it up on the altar if it's disqualified? Mikra v'echi karva. Mimashke Yisrael. How can we bring it? Doesn't it state Mimashke Yisrael from the Mashke Yisrael? It says in the pasuk of Ezekiel, which means that the only thing that could be brought as a carbon is Minam Mutar Yisrael. Only something that's allowed for the Yisrael is allowed to be brought as a carbon. And this is not something that's mutar for Yisrael because it's not yet permitted until you bring the Minchas Omer. So now we have the answer of Rav Barava, which will take up basically the rest of this Amud. Says Rav Barava, Kasavar Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish's other position that it's not considered to be prohibited because Ein Mechusar Zman Bo Bayom, since it's only lacking something that will be permitted that day. Since that day it will become permitted after they'll bring the Minchas Omer. So therefore, it's not considered like it's in the wrong time yet. And so it's not lacking time, and so therefore it's able to be brought. So this concept of it's not yet time for something doesn't apply if it's the same day. And that's the principle that Rav Barava says is the basis of Reish Lakish. So Masav Rav Breder of Yitzchak. So Rav Breder of Yitzchak challenges Rav Barava's explanation of Reish Lakish, because we have the Brisa, and the Brisa says Yesh ba'ofos shem b'menachos, yesh b'menachos shem ofos. Some qualities to birds that are not by the menachos, and there's some qualities to the grain offering that are not by the ofos. Yesh ba'ofos. What does the birds have? Sheba ofos ba'im min dava shnaim. A bird offering can come with a partnership. 2 people could bring it, but that doesn't apply to a mincha because the mincha can only be brought 1 person at a time. Number 2, hutru mikal isuran. bekodesh. Masha'en came Menachos. That generally speaking, there's an aspect of the birds that are prohibited, but for Kodesh we allow it. And what's that? That's the case of the Malika, that we kill the bird for the sacred manner by sticking the thumb through the neck. That's Maliko, but by regular carbon, that would make it, by regular killing of a bird, that would make it disqualified, a nevela. And the third thing that birds have that Menachos don't have is we said three things. It's brought. Oh wait, did I skip one? Hold on, let's read. Yesh bo b'shem bam b'nedav l'shnayim. And number two, mechusar kapara. That the birds are brought from mechusar and kapara. The four, the zav, zava, mitzora, and the yoedis, who are not able to eat the kachim until they bring a carbon. They bring birds and not grain offerings. And then we have this last thing we said, that Hutrim Mikol Sur Mekodesh. And what does Menachos have that the Ophos don't have? Yesh Menachos Menachos to Unos Kli. Menachos required to be put into a utensil. Utinufa, they're required to be waved. Vagasha, you need to bring the mincha to touch to the corner of the altar. V'yeshnam b'tzibur kibiyachid. And also they are something that's brought as a communal offering, like an individual offering, Masha Incame Ophos, and doesn't apply to birds. V'misa, and now you said you're three, and one of these three is Hutru Mikali Sur Mekodesh, that there's something that's allowed by Ophos, which is prohibited in the temple, which is prohibited generally speaking. Well, now we have something that's also allowed by Menachos, which generally speaking is prohibited. If it's the case that you could bring the Minchas Omer offering that day, I mean, it's permitted, even though by the regular grain, it's still prohibited that day. So that's the case. What the Gemara says, Vim Isa, if you're correct, but Menachos Naman Mishkachas the Hutrim Mikalas or Mekodesh. By Menachos, we also have this case. Umayni, what is this example? Minchas Omer. Don't we have the case of Minchas Omer that it's Hutrim Mikalas or Mekodesh? So the Gemara says no. The answer is, Kivan, since we established this principle, the that since the very day is when it's going to be permitted, it's not going to be considered mechusar's man. Therefore, lavi suro, it's not going to be considered something that is actually prohibited. So it's not, it doesn't fit within this category of butcher mikoli sur mekodesh boker tova in the bottom of Hayom and Aleph. So the Gemara again is challenging Rav Ada bar Abba's explanation of Reish Lakish that again, Reish Lakish has said that the mincha that Omer that was brought Shalom Lishma is disqualified, is going to not be. He says Reish Lakish's position is that it's kshera, but it cannot be eaten until the regular minchas Omer is brought. And Rav Ada bar Abba explained that we don't have to be worried. How can you bring something that's prohibited? Because he says it's not prohibited because that same day it will be permitted. That's called Ein Mechutzer's Malabul Bayom. So Rav Sheshes challenges this from the law of the. So Rav Sheshes challenges this from the case of the Mitzorah. That the Mitzorah, there's a specific order that you have to first place the blood on the Kohen places the blood on the Mitzorah, and then after he does that, he has to sprinkle the oil towards the base of Mikdash, and then after he does that, he places the oil on the Mitzorah. So what does the Brisa say? It says, Rav Sheshes, Hiktim. So it says in the Brisa, it says, Hiktim matan shemen or matan dam. Let's say the Kohen put the blood on the Mitzorah put the oil on the Mitzorah before the blood. Yimalenu shemen, he has to refill up the oil. The yachzer v'itein shemen acher, and then after he puts the blood, he has to put new oil. Matan dam, acher matan dam. Let's say matan bahonos or matan sheva. Let's say he put the oil on the ear and the thumb and the toe of the Mitzorah before he did the 7 sprinklings. So again, he did it out of order. Yimalenu shemen v'yachzer v'itein matan bahonos acher matan sheva. So again, he has to redo it and do it properly in the order. Now, Amr says Rav Sheshes, if you're going to say like Rav Ada bar Abba says, that Reish Lakish's position is then if it's going to be done later that day, it's not going to be considered like it's not yet the time to do it. Why does he have to redo it? It doesn't matter. We don't care about time. It's the same day. It could be out of order. So Rav Papa says no. Shani Hilchos Mitzora, Dichsiva Bu Avaya. No, Hilchos Mitzora is different. It has to be done specifically in the right order because it has the word Havaya. The Amar cause of Zos Tiyeh Torah Mitzora. Tiyeh Ba'Havaya Satiyeh. It has to be done in the right order, but specifically the first step. Again, another challenge to Rav Ada bar Abba is Masav Rav Papa. Hiktim Chataso La'ashamo. So by the Mitzora, that you have to bring a carbon asham, and then you have to bring the carbon chatas. Let's say you brought your chatas before your asham. You can't have somebody else say, okay, don't worry, I'll just stir the blood of the chatas until it's ready to be, until you're done with the asham. So you have to let it go bad, and then you have to burn it all. But amai, why? Amai. First of all, the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Why is Rav Papa asking the question? Didn't Rav Papa just tell us that by Mitzvah it has to be in order? Your question is, how come it's disqualified if it's done out of order? But Rav Papa just said by the Mitzvah, it has to be done specifically in order. Rav Papa, Rav Papa Amar, Shani Elchos Mitzvah, Avaya. So didn't Rav Papa just say that the laws of Mitzvah are different because it has to be done exactly that way? El Rav Papa, this is what Rav Papa is really asking. Ema Hani Mili Avoda, maybe it has to be done specifically in order when it's one of the avodas, when it's a specific service. But shlita lav avoda, but shlita is not considered a technical term of an avoda, because shlita is kshera by a non-kohen. That's one reason, or maybe shlita can be done even on chulin. But anyway, the shlita is not avoda, and so therefore. The question is, if there's not a defect of doing it too early, if the same day will be permitted, why don't you just let somebody bring the asham and then bring the chatas at that point? So therefore, Rav Papa says we have to reject Rav Ada bar Abba's explanation of Reish Lakish. Again, Reish Lakish is saying you could bring the carbon mincha, even though it was not done properly, and then you could eat it only after you bring the minchas omer. So even if you could bring the first minchas omer, which is done improperly, but you can't eat it until after the other one. And how can we do that? It's not permitted for Israel. So says Rav Papa, I know time to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish's explanation is really it is permitted because Savar, hey, you're Mizrach Matir. He has this principle. Now, once that we were working under the assumption that what allows new grain to be in, really, we thought it was the Omer when the Omer was brought. But actually, no, the explanation is not when the Omer was brought, but it's really the when the sun rises on the 16th day of Nisan. That's what allows the Omer to be brought. And so therefore, really, it's permitted at this point. The Rabbi Yochanan, the Reish Lakish, Amit Ravayu, Avihu B'zman Shebeis Hamikdash Kayim. Even when the temple was standing, Heyer Mizrach Matir. That when the sun rose, then it was permitted. And Rashi explains on top of Emma Beis, it's based upon the fact ad etzem. So until that day, meaning to say until the appearance. Ad Bechron. Bechron is the appearance of the day. So when the appearance of the day came, that allowed it. And the reason why you have to wait is because it's the ideal mitzvah is to wait until the bringing of the Omer. But technically speaking, it's permitted at that point. So the Gemara says, let's just do a coda to Reish Lakish's position. And furthermore, this idea that Reish Lakish says that the Minchas Omer was brought Shalom Shema, it's kosher, but you have to wait until the new Minchas Omer is brought in order to eat it. That is not said explicitly, beferish, but it's implied. The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah later on in Menachos. You can't bring the mincha of the bikurim. You can't bring the menachos of the bikurim. You can't bring any menachos or any bikurim. You can't bring the grain offerings and the first fruits uminchas behema or an nesachim associated with an animal. Kodem wa omer. You can't bring them from the new grain until you bring the omer offering because we need mashke Yisrael. And if you brought them, pasul. And also kodem l'shtei alechem, and also before the two loaves are bread. Well, Yavi, I mean, on Shavuos, you can't bring the Menachos or the Bikurim that are brought from wheat. Also, you can't bring that, Vimhavi, and if you brought them, kosher, it will be kosher. But Amar Rabbi, it's like Amar Shlakish, Shanu El Bar Basar B'Chamisha Sar. When do we say that you can't bring these offerings before the barley offering is brought? That's on the 14th day and the 15th day of a Bashisha Sar. But if it's the 16th day, then we're going to say, so on the 16th day, it would be kosher. So we see from here, Alma Kasavar Eir Mizrach Mater. He didn't say, he said basically on the 16th day it's allowed. And he didn't say once the Omer was brought. The 16th day, it would be okay in the morning. And so that's where Rich Lakish implies it. So yeah, we've seen now two positions about the Minchas Omer. Position of Rav is that if it's brought Shalom Shema, we're going to say it's disqualified. It's totally disqualified. Rich Lakish's position is it's kosher, but you can't eat it until you bring the new Omer. Whereas now we have the position of Rava, third position. Rava says, Minchas Omer shekam shelo lishma kishera v'shira necholen. Not only is it kosher, you don't even have to wait. Like Reish Lakish said, you have to wait until the new Omer is bought. Rava says you don't have to wait. Why? Why? You don't need a new mincha to allow it to be in, and the reason is your thought process is irrelevant. Your thought process will not disqualify the Omer unless the only way thought can disqualify, intent can disqualify, is you need one of three circumstances, all three circumstances. It has to be done by Misha Roy Lavoda. It has to be done by somebody who's capable of doing the avoda. Number two, but Davar Roy Lavoda. It has to be done by something on something that is appropriate for avoda, and in a place that's appropriate for avoda. What is b'misha royal avoda? Lafuke kohen balmum. This comes to exclude the kohen of a balmum. Meaning, say a kohen or balmum, he's not capable of doing the avoda. So if he has a blemish and he has an improper thought, it's not going to be disqualified. That comes to exclude Minchas Omer, our case. So the thought is irrelevant in this case of the Minchas Omer, because the Minchas Omer is not something that's Roy Lavoda. Why? And Rash explains, because Minchas Omer comes from barley, and the typical Mincha is from wheat, with the exception of the Minchas Sota. And so therefore, it's only permitted for this Avoda. And so therefore it's going to, your machshava will not disqualify. Because it's a novel concept in the sense that it contradicts the rest of the rules of mincha. And third, it comes to the case where if the altar was damaged and you did the avoda with improper thought, it's not going to disqualify. Your thought is not going to disqualify. So now, we're up to the Brisa. Tana Rabbanan. So now the Gemara is going to introduce a new topic, which will relate back to what we're discussing. Tana Rabbanan. It says in the Brisa, Kishu Omer Minat Bakar. It says in the pasuk Minat Bakar. It says Im Ola Karbano Minat Bakar. If you bring an Ola from the cattle, and the earlier pasuk Rashi tells us says Minat Beima. It says if you bring it from the animal to exclude an animal that was Rovev and nearby was involved in a sexual sin, and Minat Bakar Lotzi. It comes to exclude an animal that was worshipped. Minatzon to exclude an animal that was set aside. So when it says Minat Bakar a second time, what's it coming to teach us? Because it already said Minat Bakar above, and we said that's coming to exclude from being brought an animal that's worshipped. It's coming to exclude Minat Bakar Matash, Ein Tam Omer. It doesn't need to say it. It's telling us that if you brought an animal that was treifa, that it had this internal defect or this defect that makes it not kosher, then you're not going to fill your obligation. You cannot bring that as a carbon. You can't bring a treifa as a carbon. So that's learned out from the pasuk. So now the Gemara is going to say, why do we need a pasuk to tell us that? We have a kal v'chomer. And the Gemara is going to say, maybe that's not a good kal v'chomer. And that's what basically the rest of the Amud and the first half of tomorrow's Amud is about. So we say, Elohoti, it's a treifa. Valodinu, why do we need a pasuk? Can we do a kal v'chomer? Mal bal mum. just like an animal that has a blemish, shemuteris lahajo, which is kosher animal. If it has, let's say, a cataract, it's a kosher animal, but asur l'gvoa. But yeah, you can't bring it as a carbon. A treifa, shasur lahajot, a treifa animal which you can't eat. It's not kosher. Ain't din shasur l'gvoa. For sure, it should be prohibited. So that's the kal v'chomer. Why do you need a pasuk to tell me a treifa is no good? Well, treifa is not even kosher, so for sure it can't be brought. So the Gemara says, no, I'll break the kal v'chomer. Blood and fat, which are prohibited, they prove that you need a pasuk, that the kal v'chomer is no good. Shasur lahajot. Those are prohibited for a regular person to eat. Umutar and legavoa, and yet they go on the altar. The Gemara says, no. Don't tell me that breaks the kal v'chomer, because the chayil and dam are different. Mal chayil v'dam she'kein ba miklal heter. So they come from chayil and dam come from an animal that's permitted. Tomar b'treifa shekua asura. So you're going to say that by a treifa which is entirely prohibited. So velote. So the Gemara says velote mutaras legavoa. And so therefore we might have thought it should not be complete. We would know for sure it's not permitted for the altar. So again, the Gemara has a pasuk saying a treifa is prohibited, and we say, why do you need a treifa? It's a kal v'chomer. We try to say it's not a kal v'chomer from chayil, but then we say no, yet it still is. So the Gemara says, okay, malika tochiach. Let's prove it from malika, which is an animal which is not killed through slaughtering, a bird that's not killed through slaughtering. Shekua iser vasur lahajot. It's prohibited for a not in the temple. Yet in the temple you could do it. So therefore that's why we need the pasuk. The Gemara said, no, that doesn't break our kal v'chomer, because malika shekain kedushasa osarta, meaning to say that its kedusha is what makes it prohibited for a non-kohen. But masha'en came a treifa, but that's not the case by treifa. She'en kedusha osarta. The treifa is prohibited, nothing to do with its holiness. V'imei shafta, and if you're going to challenge this kal v'chomer, kishu omer mina bakar mata, that says, continues the brisa, and if you're going to challenge this kal v'chomer, kishu omer mina bakar mata she'en tam omer lo tzias atreifa. So when it says mina bakar below, it's coming to teach us to exclude a treifa. So the Gemara says, well, how could you have broken this kal v'chomer? What would be my shafta? How would you break this kal v'chomer? So there's simin rakiach mar ada l'shisha. So there's 6 ways. They think you could break the kal v'chomer. Again, the kal v'chomer says, of course, treifa can't be brought as a carbon because it's not kosher. So no, we need a pasuk. So how can you break that kal v'chomer? Amarav mishum the ikala memar, by our case, because you could have broken it by saying minchas omer tokiach. The case of the mincha of the omer should prove it. Shasur lahajot, that this omer is prohibited for a non-kohen to eat, and therefore they can't bring it as a carbon. Umutaras legavoa, and yet we're allowed to bring it as a carbon. So too, a treifa might have been permitted. The Gemara says, what kind of logic is that? Malam minchas omer shekemat teres chadash. No, the minchas omer is what itself is allowing it. That's the basic way in which the crops are prohibited. That's obviously not breaking our kal v'chomer. So no, b'shvius. Well, what about on shvius? Well, it doesn't allow the crops. Meaning to say that in the shvius year, even something that is prohibited to the hedgehog can be permitted for the temple, because even though it's prohibited because of chadash, nevertheless, it's going to be permitted to go on the altar. And you can't say, yeah, it's Materas Chadash, because in that year it's still prohibited to plant. And so therefore Shvius is different. The Gemara says, no, Shvius Nami, no, it's still permitted. Shekem Materas Svich, and it's going to allow the new grain, the grain that wasn't planted, that grew on its own, B'Shvius. So the Gemara says, no. We still have a question, like Rabbi Akiva says, Svichen Masur Meshvius. So Rabbi Akiva says that wouldn't work because the tzvichin are still prohibited in shvius. So Amar Rav Acha bar Abba or Rav Ashi or Rabbi Akiva nami lefach. He could even challenge Rabbi Akiva by saying Malam minchas omer shekein materas chadash b'chutzlaretz. Yeah, it still will allow. There's no shvius outside of Israel. There's no shmita outside of Israel, but it will allow the chadash and chutzlaretz. So therefore, you can't say that it's different than the case of the treifa. And even according to position who says that Chodesh outside of Israel is not biblically prohibited. Shekaim ba. So we could say it's different. Shekaim ba lahatir lav shabasocha, because it's coming. We could say it's not a good, that you can't challenge the Kal. You can't prove, you can't break the Kal V'chomer from the Minchas Omer, Shekaim Bala Hatir Lav Shebesocha, because it's coming to allow the prohibition of Chodesh that's within it, because as a result of it, even if the Chodesh is not going to the new grain elsewhere, within the Minchas Omer itself, it will be permitted. So therefore, Gemara first says, if you're going to say that the mincha on the shvius can be brought because it allows the prohibition within it, treifa nami tikarv. Well, why don't we allow the treifa itself to be brought? And it's going to be allowing the prohibition within it. Ela parachachi. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe this is the question to break the kavachomer from treifa. And that seems so obvious. This is the mitzvah. That's how you do the mitzvah of the Omer. Don't bring the kavachomer from treifa. That treifa should be permitted because the Omer is permitted. The Omer is a mitzvah. You have to do it, unlike the treifa. So the Gemara brings, other ways to say that maybe you could break the treifa of the kavachomer. Reish Lakish says, Mishum the Iko Ameimar Mefatim HaKetoras Yochiach. Reish Lakish says, by the way, I just want to say that Chodesh, whether or not Chodesh is biblically prohibited outside of the land of Israel, is one of the bases for the fact that not everybody is strict about making sure that they're eating the yashan flour. That if it's a mitzvah, you can't eat the new grain until after Pesach. So after the second day of Pesach. So how come outside of Israel a lot of people are not strict? Really, the answer is most people should be strict. But outside of Israel, so one of the theories is that because it's only rabbinically prohibited outside of Israel, and because we're not sure which is the new grain, which is the old grain, it's what's called a svek tzveika, it's a double doubt, and therefore it's permitted. This is part of the basis, but a lot of people reject it because nowadays, first of all, we don't know if Chodesh is prohibited rabbinically. Second of all, or biblically. Second of all, nowadays, you can tell which grain it is. You don't have to go through a question. You can easily get the old grain. It's not a problem. Okay, anyway, back to the case. We said we should prove from a Kal V'chomer, from a treifa, that it's prohibited. And Gemara says, but if you're going to break it, that Kal V'chomer, we have a pasuk. Well, how would you break it? Reish Lakish says, maybe you could break it. The one who makes the ketoras will prove it. That person who makes the ketoras is prohibited. Is allowed for the temple. The Gemara first says what this language doesn't make sense. You're saying the one who makes the ketoras, that's a man. That doesn't make sense. Of course, the man. No, the Gemara says no. The making of the ketoras should prove it. Because a non-Kohen is not allowed to do it. So we see that non-Kohen is not allowed to do it, and it's allowed for the temple. So don't bring a proof to me from a treifa from that Kal V'chomer. Where says, no, don't bring that question. No, that's actually the mitzvah. Same question, same answer as the Omer. The way you could break the Kal V'chomer is Shabbos yochichu. Shabbos will prove it. You're not allowed to violate the Shabbos. But in the Beit HaMikdash, you're allowed to bring the Karban Musaf, the Karban Tamid, you do the Shlita. So Gemara says, no, no, there's also cases where it's a mitzvah outside of the Beit HaMikdash for you to violate the Shabbos to do a circumcision. Gemara says, no, that's not hedjot. Who you think miwa is hedjot like a treifa? No, miwa is a mitzvah. That's when you're allowed to break it. It's a circumcision. So Gemara says, okay, take away that suggestion. Shabbos, don't bring me a proof from Shabbos. Same answer as before. That's the mitzvah. To bring a Karban Musaf is the mitzvah. So don't say, well, just like Shabbos, you're allowed to violate it. Also, treifa, you would be allowed to violate it and bring it on the altar. Rav Ava says, no, you can't bring the Kal. You can't prove them in the Kal V'chomer mishum the Iko Ameimar Klayim Yochichu. No, you could have brought a proof from Klayim. Shai asur la'ajot, they're prohibited for the ajot. Umutar la'gavoa, even though a person, generally speaking, is not allowed to wear klayim, but in the temple you could wear it. So the Gemara says, no, don't bring me a proof from klayim. Mala klayim shekain huchmikol and etzel hedjot but tzitzis. No, by tzitzis you can wear klayim. So, and that's not in the temple. The Gemara says, atu tzitzis torach hedjot mitzvah. That's a mitzvah. Same answer. Ella says the Gemara. Same answer as before. Don't bring me a question from Klaim, but that's actually the mitzvah. Rav Sheshes Berei de Rav Idi Amar Mishum de Iko Meimar. So, okay, this is today's daf. We'll stop here. This is today's daf. Pick this up, but we can go and continue now. I'll just stop the recording. If we have a few more minutes, we'll just continue.